I went to Shanghai, a skeptic. I want to begin there, honestly, because the skepticism is the whole point of the story. And if I pretend I arrived with an open and neutral mind, I will have falsified the most important part of what happened. For years, I had heard the China growth story, and like a great many investors and observers in the West, I developed toward it a kind of reflexive skepticism that I had never fully examined. I knew the counter narrative well, perhaps too well. The ghost cities built and left empty, the mountain of debt, particularly in the property sector, the demographic decline that would supposedly cap the whole thing, the sense absorbed from 100 articles and conversations that the numbers were inflated, that the story was at least partly propaganda, that the growth was more fragile and more overstated than its promoters claimed. I I had these positions and I held them with a quiet confidence. And I went to Shanghai, if I am honest with myself, at least half expecting to have that skepticism confirmed, to see behind the impressive facade to the fragility I was sure was there. And I want to be careful here because the story I am about to tell could easily be misread. And I want to prevent the misreading at the outset. This is not a story of conversion. I did not go to Shanghai a skeptic and come back a believer in some triumphant narrative about China. I am not interested in cheerleading for any government or any system, and I have no political argument to make. And equally, I did not come back with my old skepticism intact, congratulating myself on having seen through the hype. What actually happened is more subtle and I think more genuinely useful than either of those. What happened is that direct observation forced a recalibration, not of my politics, which are not the point, but of my framework as an investor, of the specific mental model I use to think about where genuine value accumulates in the world and how to position capital in relation to it. I came back a different investor. And the difference was not that I had swapped one narrative for its opposite. The difference was that I had been forced to confront the limits of a way of seeing and to update a model that I had, without quite realizing it, allowed to harden. Let me think carefully about skepticism itself, because it sits at the center of this, and because I think it is one of the most important and most double-edged qualities an investor can possess. Skepticism is a genuine intellectual virtue. It is the thing that protects you from narratives, from hype, from the enthusiasms that sweep through markets and separate credulous people from their capital. The investor without skepticism is prey to every story, buys every top, believes every projection, and is reliably destroyed by their own credulity. So I do not want to disparage skepticism because I hold it to be genuinely essential. And I arrived in Shanghai armed with it precisely because it had served me well. But there is a specific failure mode of skepticism that I had not adequately guarded against. And it is a subtle one. And I think it is worth naming precisely because so many intelligent people fall into it without ever noticing. The failure mode is this: skepticism, which begins as a healthy refusal to accept claims without evidence, can quietly harden into a fixed prior that no longer updates on evidence at all. The skeptic who begins by saying, "Show me the evidence," can gradually become the person who, when shown the evidence, dismisses it, explains it away, finds reasons to discount it, and thereby holds the original position, not because the evidence supports it, but because the position has become comfortable and identity forming and difficult to abandon. And at that point, the skeptic has undergone a quiet and unnoticed transformation. They have stopped being a skeptic, which is someone who updates on evidence, and become a believer in the opposite narrative, someone who holds a fixed position that evidence cannot move. And the tragedy is that this transformation feels from the inside exactly like continued skepticism. The person still experiences themselves as the hard-headed realist refusing to be taken in, when in fact they have become as close to evidence as the credulous believer they disdain, simply pointed in the other direction. This is what direct observation is for, and it is why I place such value on going and seeing things directly rather than filtering all experience through the ambient narratives that surround every significant subject. Because the ambient narratives, whether they are the bullish narrative or the skeptical counter narrative, are always partial, always shaped by the interests and the limitations of the people producing them, and they can be absorbed and held without ever confronting the friction of direct evidence. Going and seeing forces, the prior to confront something it cannot easily dismiss, the evidence of your own eyes, the texture of direct experience, and that confrontation is the thing that can break a prior that has hardened into an unexamined fixture. I went to Shanghai to see for myself, and seeing for myself did exactly what direct observation is supposed to do. It forced a recalibration. The first thing that recalibrated, and it recalibrated within the first day, was my sense of time horizons. And I want to develop this carefully because it turned out to be the deepest of all the shifts. The infrastructure struck me immediately, and I do not mean this in the narrow sense of roads and rail, though the high-speed rail is genuinely extraordinary, cleaner and faster and more reliable than almost anything in the developed West. I mean it in the broader sense of the physical expression of a time horizon. Because what the infrastructure communicates once you are moving through it is not primarily convenience. It is the time horizon of the people who built it. This was not built for this decade. It was built for the next several decades, planned and executed in the full awareness that the return on the investment would arrive over a very long horizon and that this was acceptable because the people making the decisions were thinking on that horizon. And standing inside that, I had a genuinely uncomfortable realization about my own skepticism, which is that much of it had been an artifact of a horizon mismatch. I had been evaluating a decade scale, generation scale builder using the quarter scale and year scale metrics that dominate the investment culture I come from. And a great deal of what looked like fragility or waste or overstatement through the short horizon lens looked entirely different through the long horizon lens that the builders were actually using. The ghost cities that looked like folly on a 2-year view looked like deliberate ahead of demand construction on a 20-year view. I am not saying every such judgment reverses under a longer lens. I am saying that I had not been separating the genuine problems from the artifacts of my own short horizon, and that some meaningful portion of my confident skepticism was the latter, masquerading as the former. The principles that determine where durable value actually accumulates, and how an investor should think about positioning through long horizon transitions, rather than reacting to short horizon noise, are worth studying deliberately and as a connected whole, and there is a body of work that lays them out carefully, called the Naval Codex. It is not a set of tactics, and it is not a market forecast. It is a systematic account of the underlying principles that determine who builds and preserves genuine wealth through long transitions, of how leverage and specific knowledge and ownership and time horizons interact. If you want to engage with those principles directly, the framework is linked in the description, and there is a code on the screen you can scan to reach it. And engaging with the principles directly is what matters most, because the principles are what hold across every particular market and every particular geography, and the particulars are always changing. The second recalibration came in Shenzhen, and it concerned something I had, as an investor, been quietly mispricing for years, which is the nature and the durability of manufacturing capability. I had absorbed, without ever examining it, the narrative that is so embedded in Western economic thinking as to be nearly invisible. The narrative that manufacturing is a lower form of economic activity, a commodity, something to be efficiently offshored to wherever labor is cheapest, while the high-value activities remained in design and finance and branding and intellectual work. And walking through the density of Shenzhen, the concentration of manufacturers and engineers and suppliers and the accumulated tacit knowledge of millions of people who have spent their careers learning how to make things work at scale, I understood that I had been mispricing this profoundly. Because what is concentrated there is not a cost advantage that can be competed away by finding cheaper labor somewhere else. It is an ecosystem advantage an accumulation of tacit knowledge and relationships and supply chain density that took decades to build and that is genuinely difficult to replicate quickly, a kind of moat that does not appear on any balance sheet and that most financial analysis focused on the numbers that are easy to measure systematically overlooks. You cannot build that density in 5 years. It is the product of a generation of accumulated experience, and it compounds because everyone who needs to build something at scale in hardware has a reason to be in the ecosystem, and their presence deepens it further. This is network effects applied not to a software platform, but to physical manufacturing. And as an investor, I had been treating a compounding, hard to replicate moat as though it were a fungible commodity. And that was a genuine error in my framework, exposed by direct observation of the thing itself. The third recalibration is the one that connects most directly to what it means to be a different investor, and it concerned money itself. And it was, in some ways, the most humbling because it revealed a piece of skepticism I had never even thought to apply. Moving through China, I could not help but notice the payment infrastructure, the comprehensive, sophisticated, domestically controlled financial system that operates entirely independently of the dollar-based architecture that governs most of the world's financial flows. For 10 days, I barely encountered a single situation in which the dollar-centric financial system had any relevance at all. And this forced a realization that had nothing to do with China and everything to do with me and with most investors like me. It was this. I had spent years applying rigorous skepticism to the China story, scrutinizing every claim, discounting every projection. And I had never once applied that same skepticism to the enormous unexamined concentration risk embedded in my own position and in the position of nearly everyone I knew, which is that our entire financial lives, our assets, our income, our sense of what is safe were denominated in and dependent on a single monetary and institutional system, a concentration so total that we could not even see it, because that system was the very unit in which we measured everything. I had been the hard-headed skeptic about the distant thing and the complete believer, without ever noticing it was a belief about the concentration right beneath my own feet. The skepticism I had so carefully applied outward, I had never turned inward, toward the unexamined assumption that the system I was concentrated in was permanent and safe simply because it was the system I happened to be standing inside. The way capital actually moves when a monetary order begins to shift, where it flows and why, and what happens to different asset positions and to the currencies and systems that anchor them is worth understanding in its specific mechanics rather than in the vague and comfortable assumption that the current arrangement is permanent. And there is a framework that traces exactly this, called the dragon pivot. Despite the name, it is not really about any single country. It is about how monetary transitions unfold across history, what they do to concentrated positions, and how those who understood them early diversified away from the unexamined concentration before it mattered. You can reach it through the code shown on the screen or through the link in the description if you want the fuller picture. And the fuller picture matters here because the deepest risk an investor faces is very often the concentration they cannot see, precisely because it is the frame through which they see everything else. The fourth recalibration followed naturally from the others, and it concerned the question that every investor eventually has to answer, which is what to actually own. And what direct observation clarified for me is a distinction I had understood in the abstract, but had not felt with the force that seeing it directly provided, which is the distinction between owning genuine productive capability and owning mere financial claims. Because what I saw accumulating in China was productive capability in its most concrete form, real manufacturing, real energy infrastructure, real technological depth, the physical foundations of economic power. And the lesson for an investor is not, I want to be clear, that one should therefore buy Chinese assets, which would be its own kind of unupdated conclusion. The lesson is deeper and more portable than any geographic bet. It is that genuine, durable value accumulates in productive capability in the ownership of things that produce real value in the world, and not in the financial claims and paper abstractions that are so much easier to buy and so much more fragile to hold. The investor who owns genuine productive capability, wherever in the world it is, owns something grounded in real economic activity, resistant to the monetary and institutional disruptions that erode purely financial claims. The investor who owns only paper claims on a strained system owns something that resembles wealth in favorable conditions and reveals its fragility when conditions turn. The work of distinguishing genuine productive capability from mere financial engineering and of building a position grounded in things that produce real value rather than in speculation or paper claims is worth doing systematically, and there is a framework devoted precisely to that called the Sovereign Vault. It is concerned with building durable, generationally significant wealth grounded in real productive assets and real institutional protection, rather than in the financial engineering that looks like wealth in good conditions and dissolves in bad ones. It is linked below, and the code on the screen will take you straight to it for anyone who wants to go deeper on the question of what to actually own. And that question is, in the end, the one that separates the investor who preserves wealth through a transition from the investor who merely appeared wealthy until the transition arrived. I want to add one further dimension. Because it sharpens all of the recalibrations and because it is where the productive frontier is genuinely moving, and that is the intersection of manufacturing and energy and artificial intelligence. Because what I observed was not merely a large manufacturing ecosystem and not merely serious artificial intelligence development and not merely enormous investment in cheap and abundant energy, but the combination of all three, and the combination is the thing. Artificial intelligence applied to a manufacturing ecosystem that already has extraordinary depth can accelerate the cycle of building and testing and improving by orders of magnitude. And both the manufacturing and the artificial intelligence run on energy, and the country or the enterprise with the cheapest and most abundant energy has a structural cost advantage in every energy-intensive process, including the computation that trains and runs the artificial intelligence itself. The combination of world-class manufacturing, serious artificial intelligence, and cheap, abundant energy is a compounding advantage, each element amplifying the others. And as an investor, the recalibration was in understanding that the productive frontier, the place where genuine new capability is being generated most rapidly, is being defined by exactly this convergence. And that a framework which did not account for it was a framework that would consistently mislead. Now, I want to step back to the deepest thing, the thing beneath all the specific recalibrations, because it is the thing that genuinely made me a different investor, and it is not a view about China at all. It is a view about how an investor should hold views. What Shanghai taught me at the deepest level is that the most dangerous thing for an investor is not being wrong, because everyone is wrong constantly. And being wrong is survivable and correctable. The most dangerous thing is being unable to update, holding a prior so firmly and so comfortably that direct evidence bounces off it without leaving a mark. And I had been in genuine danger of exactly this without knowing it, because my skepticism about China had hardened quietly and unnoticed from a healthy refusal to accept unsupported claims into a fixed position that I was defending rather than testing. And the reason this is so dangerous and so common is that the hardened prior feels like wisdom. It feels like the hard-won judgment of the experienced investor who has seen through many hype cycles and refuses to be taken in again. But the wisdom of having seen through past hype and the closed-mindedness of refusing to update on present evidence feel, from the inside, exactly the same, and the only thing that reliably distinguishes them is the willingness to confront the evidence directly and to let it change the model when it should. And I want to think honestly about why investors and people generally fail to update, because understanding the mechanism is the only defense against it. The first reason is that updating is uncomfortable. It requires admitting that a position you held with confidence, perhaps publicly, was wrong or at least incomplete. And the discomfort of that admission is a powerful force pushing you to explain away the evidence rather than integrate it. The second reason is that the hardened prior has usually become identity forming. The skeptic about China has over years built a piece of their identity around being the clear-eyed realist, and to update the position feels like a threat to the self, not merely a revision of a view. And the third reason, the deepest, is that the comfortable prior requires no action, while updating requires the difficult work of actually changing your positioning, of diversifying away from the concentration you had not noticed, of doing the uncomfortable and effortful things that a genuinely updated model demands. It is far easier to hold the position that requires nothing of you than to update to the position that requires you to actually change what you own and how you are exposed. And so the evidence is dismissed, the prior is defended, and the investor congratulates themselves on their skepticism while quietly failing to do the one thing that skepticism, properly understood, is supposed to enable, which is the updating of the model in response to evidence. So let me be very clear about what the practical lesson is, because it would be easy to draw the wrong one. The lesson is not to buy China. That would be merely replacing one unupdated prior reflexive skepticism with another reflexive enthusiasm, and it would be exactly the same error pointed in the opposite direction. The lesson is not geographic at all. You do not need to move your capital to Shanghai to benefit from what Shanghai has to teach. The lesson is about how to hold your views, which is to hold them loosely enough that direct evidence can change them, and about where to look, which is toward genuine productive capability wherever it is accumulating in the world, and about the specific concentration risk that most investors carry without ever examining it, the total dependence on a single monetary and institutional system that is invisible precisely because it is the frame through which everything else is seen. The practical implication is to diversify away from the unexamined concentration to orient toward genuine productive capability rather than fragile financial claims, and above all, to hold every prior, including the comfortable, skeptical ones, loosely enough that you remain capable of the updating that is the whole point of thinking clearly in the first place. So I want to end, as I always do, not with an exhortation, but with an invitation to see clearly, because this is, in the end, an old lesson dressed in the specific circumstances of a particular trip. The old lesson is that direct observation is more reliable than ambient narrative, that the map is not the territory, that the willingness to go and see and to let what you see change your model is one of the deepest forms of intelligence there is. It is not new. What was new for me was the force with which 10 days of direct observation broke a prior I had not even known had hardened, and the humility of realizing that the skepticism I had been so proud of had quietly become the very thing skepticism is supposed to protect against, a fixed belief, immune to evidence. I do not regret having gone a skeptic. The skepticism was not wrong to have. Skepticism is the right default, the correct posture toward every unsupported claim and every seductive narrative, and I would arrive a skeptic again. What was wrong was not the arriving a skeptic. What would have been wrong was the leaving a skeptic, the holding of the position after the evidence had contradicted it, the defense of the comfortable prior against the friction of what I had seen with my own eyes. And so I came back a different investor, not because I had adopted a new narrative to replace the old one, but because I had been reminded viscerally and unforgettably that the whole discipline of investing well comes down to seeing clearly and updating honestly and positioning early before the thing you have seen becomes obvious to everyone. The recalibration I underwent, the shift from a hardened prior to a model capable of updating, is available to anyone willing to confront the evidence directly, rather than filtering it through the comfortable narratives that ask nothing of them. And the value of that recalibration, invisible at first, the way these things always are, reveals itself the way genuine understanding always reveals itself. Slowly, in the gradual repositioning that a clearer model makes possible, and then suddenly, at the moment, the transition you saw coming, while others were still defending their priors, finally arrives, and the ground shifts, and you find yourself, because you saw clearly and updated honestly and positioned early, standing exactly where you needed to be,